Hello everyone and welcome to JavaScript Level 1. Welcome to the first JavaScript section of the course. This section will begin to build our understanding of adding interactive functionality to our websites. And JavaScript support is actually built directly into most modern web browsers. That means we can run JavaScript directly into the browser console or as a full .js script that we connect to an HTML file, which means there's nothing to download right now. JavaScript is also a full programming language, meaning unlike HTML or CSS, it supports things such as arrays, loops, and general logic. We will briefly cover major programming concepts as we encounter them with JavaScript. Eventually, we're going to be showing you how to use JavaScript to directly change the HTML or CSS shown on a page, and we're really going to touch on that topic in the Document Object Model or DOM or DOM section of the course. To begin with, however, we're going to be focusing on just the JavaScript basics all by itself. Okay. So we're going to start off with JavaScript just straight in the browser console, and later on we'll show you how to connect full .js scripts to an HTML file. All the code used in this section can be found as .js scripts under the JavaScript Level 1 folder. Let's get started. I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome to Part 1 JavaScript Basics. In this lecture, we're going to be going to our browser, Google Chrome, and then opening up our console and walking through just the very basics of JavaScript, things such as basic data types and a few basic methods. I'm going to jump to my browser now to get started. Okay, here I am at my browser. I'm just at a new empty tab, and I've also gone incognito to make sure I don't get any JavaScript alerts if I'm logged into Gmail. And I would suggest you do the same if you're using a Gmail account. But what you're going to do is anywhere on the page, right-click, and then go all the way down to where it says Inspect. Click on that. And you should see something like this, probably not as zoomed in as mine, so more likely you'll see something that looks like this. Then you can click on Console, and you should see the console here for your browser. And this is where we can directly type in JavaScript code and see how the browser interprets it and executes it. Let's start off with the hello world of JavaScript, which is an alert. So we call alert, which is a function, and then you pass in a string. So a string is going to start off with a set of quotes. Here we have double quotes. And then whatever string you want to do. So in our case, it's going to be something like hello world. And you can see I've actually typed this before, which is why the JavaScript console is kind of helping me out there. But I'm going to hit enter, and we should see a little pop-up. And here at the top of the page, I see new tab says hello world. And there's a little click here that says prevent this page from creating additional dialogues. Do not check that box, otherwise you won't be able to see any more of your alerts. So then click OK. And we get undefined here, and we'll be explaining a lot more about function input and output and how that all works. For now, congratulations, you've written your very first line of JavaScript code. Let's continue on by talking about basic data types. So first, before we actually start that, I want to show you how you can write a comment in JavaScript. And a comment in JavaScript is just 2 forward slashes, and then anything beyond this, so anything here is a comment. And if I hit enter here, basically nothing's going to be executed because that was all a comment. So right now, let's start off with basic data types. Okay, the first basic data type are numbers. And numbers can be integers, such as 10. Floating point numbers, maybe like 20.2, which means it has a decimal. And even things like negative numbers, so negative 13.4 or something. Note that JavaScript, unlike some other languages, treats these all the same as numbers. So regardless if it's a floating point with a decimal, a whole integer, or a negative number, they all are treated as numbers in JavaScript. There's no distinction between them. At least for our very basic use cases, we don't need to worry about that. Then next, there are strings. So strings are basically strings wrapped in quotes. So we've already seen one. We've seen hello world. So here we have the string hello world, and it gets output. And then we can also even wrap digits, but note here the difference. If I wrap this number 10 in quotes, it now becomes a string instead of an actual number. And we'll talk a lot more also about how JavaScript compares strings like this to a number like this. It's unlike some other languages, so we'll have to keep an eye out for that. Okay, so those are strings, and up next I want to show you booleans. So if you haven't encountered booleans from other programming languages, they're basically logical values that can stand for true or false. And in JavaScript, it's the lowercase true or all lowercase false, and those are the booleans. And there's two more things I want to show you, which are undefined and null. And we'll talk again a lot more about these in a future lecture, but I just want you to be aware that undefined and null are not exactly the same thing, but they are available as basic data types in JavaScript. Okay, let's take a step back and focus in on numbers. So those were over here in blue, syntax highlighting numbers. And we can actually use JavaScript as a basic calculator. But before we do that, I want to show you how you can clear your console. To clear your console, just type in clear, and then close parentheses at the end of that. Hit enter, and the console will be cleared for you. Okay, so JavaScript as a basic calculator can do addition. So I can say things like 2 plus 2, and you see it responds 4. I can do subtraction, 5 minus 1, multiplication, 3 times 2, that's an asterisk for multiplication there. I can do division, for instance, 10 divided by 2 gives me 5. And note what happens if I do 2 divided by 5, it gives me 0.4. Other programming languages sometimes won't actually give you the decimal amount. JavaScript does do true division here. So 2 divided by 5 does give you the correct answer of 0.4. Then if we want to do exponents, that's 2 sets of asterisks. So for instance, if I want to do 2 to the power of 4, that's going to be asterisk asterisk 4. And then that equals 16, which is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 2 to the power of 4. And then the last mathematical operation, which you may or may not be familiar with, depending how new you are to programming, is what's known as the modulo or mod function, or really operation. It's not really a function. And basically what this does is it returns the remainder of a division. So for example, if I say 15 divided by 14 and hit enter, I get 1.07, etc., some very large decimal. But if I were to think about this in terms of remainder, I would know that 15 divided by 14 is 14 remainder 1. Now if I wanted some mathematical operation to only return that remainder, that can be shown as the mod operation, or the modulo operation, which in most programming languages, it's shown as a percent sign. So 15 mod 14 returns 1, because it's 14 remainder 1. Let's show you another example. For instance, 6 mod 2 returns 0, and that's because 2 goes into 6 evenly 3 times, so 3 remainder 0. Now if I do something like 6 mod 4, I get remainder 2, because it's going to be 4 remainder 2 to get 6. So again, this mod operation just gives you back the remainder. Okay, so we discussed numbers and how to treat JavaScript using a basic calculator. Let's clear our console again. And now let's talk about strings and some very basic operations that you can do with strings for JavaScript. So strings are just sequences of characters, and each element or character has an indexed position. So let's start with a string that just says Django is cool. And I can actually concatenate strings together. And concatenate means just bring together. So I can say something like Django, and I concatenate with plus is super cool. Hit enter, and then I see Django is super cool. But look what happened here. On that concatenation, there's no space between Django and is, because there was no space at the end of Django or at the beginning of is there. So if I want to concatenate these two strings to make sense, I can put a space there before is, and then when I concatenate those two together but with the plus sign, I see Django is super cool. So far, pretty basic stuff. If I want to grab the actual length of a string, I call the length attribute. So I say something like Django, and then call dot length off of that string. And you can see that the console actually helps you out with some autocomplete. And then here I can see there are 6 elements or 6 characters in this sequence, which is the string. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great. And then we can also check if white space counts by saying something like x space x dot length, and you see we get 3. So white space also counts. It's going to count those spaces. Now there's also escape characters in strings that are really common. For example, if I say something like hello \n, start a new line, and then hit enter here, I can see that this special escape character stands for beginning a new line. So hello, and then I start a new line with \n, and then everything else goes on a new line. Another escape character is tab. So I can say hello \t for tab, give me a tab. And this will insert a tab, essentially just 4 spaces there. And then finally, I can also do quotes. So I can say hello, and then I will say quotes, \, hit enter. And this is just a way to input quotes inside of a JavaScript string. So let me make that probably a little more clear by not using the word quotes there, but it's a \, quote, and then I can say something like jelly. And I can see that the double quote is now inside the string. And the reason you would need an escape character is if you didn't have that \ there for the escape, JavaScript would think that you wanted to just end the actual string right there at that first double quote. But instead, if you want to escape it and actually have quotes inside, you can use that escape character. So that's useful if you're trying to say something like, she said, quote, blah, 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 end quote, and then finish off the string. All right. Then finally, I want to talk about actually indexing individual characters or elements. So indexing starts at 0. So if I have hello, and I want to grab a certain character off of that string based off of its index location, for instance, I want to grab h, well, that starts at index 0. So if I do hello, and then with square brackets, input a 0 there, I get h back. Okay, before we continue on, let's see a few more examples of indexing with a string. So if I have a string again, hello, and I want to grab the letter O from this, well, I just have to count starting with index 0. So this is going to be H is 0, E is 1, the first L is 2, the second L is 3, and then the O is at index 4. And there it returns O. And we're going to learn a lot more about indexing strings later on. But what I want you to do is take a random string, maybe something like look at the dog, and then see if you can, through indexing calls, grab the letter D from this. So pause the video, see what number you have to provide to grab the letter D, just to practice. Okay, so hopefully you're able to get it. Let's see, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And there's the letter D. Okay, now let's continue on by talking about variables. I'm going to clear the console, and let's talk about variables in JavaScript. So the general form of variables in JavaScript looks something like this. You say the keyword var, then you have the variable name, and then you're going to say it's equal to whatever you want the actual value to be, and then a semicolon to let JavaScript know that you're done. And JavaScript is actually really flexible these days on what has to end with a semicolon and what doesn't have to end with a semicolon. For almost all things now, you actually don't need the semicolon anymore, but we'll keep putting it into place and we'll talk about it a little more in a future lecture. But that's the very basic format, so let's actually get some practice. I'm going to make a variable called bank account. And unlike some other programming languages, JavaScript uses camel case. And what camel case means is if you have multiple words in a variable name, the next word that you put in is going to have a capital letter. So we see bank, next word has a capital letter, and if I wanted to add something else to this, maybe the city it was in, I would then put another capital letter, etc. So that's what it looks like. So we have bank account, and then I'm going to say is equal to 100, semicolon. So now I have a variable bank account, which means if I actually call bank account, I'll get back the number or value I assigned to it. So then let's make a variable called deposit. And we'll set it equal to 50. And now let's actually do some logic with this. So I will say variable total is equal to my account plus my deposit. And it looks like it needs to be my bank account, so sorry about that. Bank account plus deposit, there it is. So we saw we had an error here, account is not defined, because I never defined something called account. I only defined something called bank account. So now here I see variable total is equal to bank account plus deposit. So if I show my total, I get 150, 100 plus 50. Okay, so let's show a couple more examples of variables. I'm going to clear my console. Let's say I create a variable called greeting, and this one's going to be a string now. I'll say something like, welcome back, colon, and then I'm going to make another variable called name, and you should go ahead and input your name here. I'll put in Jose, and then we're going to say an alert. So we should see a prompt come up. And I'm going to do greeting plus, remember we can concatenate strings, name. Hit enter, and now I see it says welcome back Jose on the very top here. Great. So if I get a variable, such as var, and I don't ever define it, so let's do that, something like my variable, and I hit enter, I get undefined. So undefined means you created something, but you never actually defined it. A null, on the other hand, so for instance, if I make a variable called bonus and assign it to the keyword null, that's going to be actually nothing that you set. And that's really the difference between null and undefined. Undefined means something was created, but it was never actually defined. So this variable exists, but it was never defined in the case of my variable. Null, on the other hand, means that you're actually setting nothing to this variable on purpose. So here we have something that's undefined, created but never defined. In the case of this variable called bonus, we actually assigned it nothing or null. So it is defined as null instead of just being undefined. Now, don't worry too much right now that all of these actions output undefined. That basically just means that there was nothing to output for all the lines of code that we were writing. Now, before we end this lecture, I want to show you just a few basic JavaScript methods that we talked about. We already know alert, but just to reiterate, alert is going to alert and pop up something in the browser. So I will say alert, hey, hit enter, and it alerts up here. And we'll be using those a lot to check our work later on in this section of the course. The other thing I want to show you is actually outputting something to the console. So a lot of the stuff we've been doing has never been outputting things to the console. If I want to output something to the console, I can use console.log and then whatever I want to output. So let's say, hey, I'm in the console. Let's hit enter. We see here now it says, hey, I'm in the console. And that's how you output something to the console. And then finally, we have prompt. So prompt is an actual key. So I will say, let's start off with just prompt. And we'll say enter something. Hit enter, and at the very top of the page, it'll say enter something. And here you can just enter whatever, hit OK, and we see the output here. If you want to save this as a variable, you can do something like var age is equal to prompt, and then we'll say enter your age. Hit enter, and up here it says enter your age, so we can enter our age. Let's say we're 90 years old, lived a good life, hit OK, and now it'll say undefined, but if I call age again, it gives me back 90. And note that it gives it back to me as a string. Okay, so we covered a lot here, but it was all the basics. Hopefully this didn't seem too complicated. I know it's a lot of stuff right now, so if you need a review, you can always check out the JavaScript basics.js script that's under the JavaScript level 1 folder, so you can actually go and practice on your own the various commands that we did in this lecture. Okay, thanks everyone, and I will see you in the next lecture where we're going to be continuing our discussion of the basics of JavaScript. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 2, Connecting JavaScript. We learned quite a bit in the last lecture, so let's take a little bit of a break and just show you how you can connect a JavaScript file, which is a .js extension file, to an HTML file. We're going to open up Atom and the browser for this, so let's hop over to them now. Okay, so here I have Atom Text Editor open, and in the Atom Text Editor I have two files, an empty HTML file called example.html and a file called myscript.js, which is also empty at this time. So what I will begin doing is typing out HTML just so we get some basic HTML here. I'm going to put heading 1 and say something like welcome to your bank. Let's save that and check that it's connected to our browser by refreshing the page, and here we see welcome to your bank. Now let's show you how you can actually connect a JavaScript file to your HTML file. And this works with the script tag. So up here we can type script, and inside of the script tag, the open tag, I'm going to write src for source, and then actually input the source of my script. And the source for my script is just myscript.js. And it goes in quotes, and then we have a closing tag, so it looks like this. And you can actually use Atom to automate this. So if I begin to type script here and I hit enter, you'll actually get this auto pop up here. You don't have to really worry about type at this point in time. So you could just use that as well for the autocomplete. But basically what we're looking for here is just a script tag where the first open script tag has the src or the source and pointing to your .js file. And right now these are both in the same directory, so all I have to do is provide the name. Now let's actually add some stuff to the .js file so we can clarify and check that it's actually working. So the very first thing I'm going to do here is in this JavaScript file, I'll put an alert that says, "Welcome to your bank." And I will save that. And let's refresh this page, and we should now, upon refreshing, see an alert that says, this page says, "Welcome to your bank," and we'll hit OK. And note over here in the HTML that I'm calling my script before I'm calling anything else in the body. So the reason that this appeared blank for a second is because I was calling my script before I called anything in my body. And we'll discuss later on what script placement and where it should go has an effect on your HTML. But let's continue on with this JavaScript file. We'll continue on with our bank example. I'm going to create a variable called deposit. And that's going to be a prompt saying, how much would you like to deposit today? Question mark. And then let's say alert. You've deposited. And then we're going to concatenate the actual deposit amount. And then I'm also going to do a console log. So I will say console.log, and we'll put something like, "You are a cool person." So let's save that, refresh our page to reload this JavaScript. And now it says, "Welcome to your bank." We hit OK. And then it says, "How much would you like to deposit today?" Let's put in 100. Click OK. We get an alert. It says, "You've deposited 100. Now we also had that console log. So I can check by right-clicking, saying inspect, and here on the console, I see "You are a cool person." Great. So that's really all there is as far as connecting a JavaScript file to an HTML file. Again, the main thing I want you to get out of this is that there's a script tag, and you can connect it to your JavaScript source, and then whatever JavaScript you have here will be uploaded whenever you refresh the page, or when you actually just visit the page for the first time. All right. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome to Part 3, your first JavaScript exercise. Let's get some practice with your new skills. You're going to be creating a very simple website that takes in a weight in imperial pounds and converts it to kilograms. The HTML is already done. All your work will just be in the connected.js file. And the relevant files can be found under JavaScript Level 1 folder, and they're called part3_exercise.html and part3.js. So at the bottom of that HTML file is the connection to the solution.js file, which is part3.js. Make sure to actually change that to your own .js file before you start. Let's quickly explore the HTML file and what this exercise actually looks like. I'm going to hop over to the editor and browser now. Okay, here I have my editor open as well as the browser connected to the HTML file. And the instructions for the exercise are actually already embedded into this HTML file. Like I mentioned, you're going to be creating a weight metric converter, taking a number in pounds and convert it to kilograms. And what you're going to be doing is at first, you need to grab this HTML file, and all the way down at the bottom we have the script. And the reason the script is at the bottom is because I want all this HTML to load before my script actually loads. So I have this script here, and right now it's connected to my own script, my script.js, but when you first open this file, it's going to be connected to part3.js. That is the solution JavaScript file. So if you want, you can run this HTML page one time so you can see what the solution looks like as far as its interaction with the website, but make sure when you're actually programming your JavaScript, you remember to change the source to your own solution. Okay, so like I said, you first want to actually change the script here so it links to your work, then use JavaScript to accept a number input in pounds. Then in your JavaScript file, convert this number to kilograms, and the conversion from pounds to kilograms is right here. You multiply it by 0.454, and then afterwards report back in an alert that the weight is now in kilograms, and then log/write conversion completed to the console. So I can see here, conversion completed in the console. Let me refresh the page and show you what this should all look like once you've come up with your solution. I'll refresh, And we see here it says, what is the weight in pounds? So I'll put in 100 pounds, click OK, and then it reports back that is 45.4 kilograms. I hit OK, and down here at the console, I see conversion completed has been logged. All right, this is a fairly simple exercise. It's actually just a few lines of JavaScript code. If you get stuck on anything, feel free to post to the Q&A forums, or just watch the next lecture where I will code through the solutions. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to the solutions lecture for the first JavaScript exercise in part 3. Let's hop to the editor and get started. Okay, so here I have my text editor of the HTML document open, and I've linked it to myscript.js, and myscript.js is currently empty. So right now if I refresh this page, nothing actually happens. So let's actually add in the logic that we need to convert this. So I'm going to create a variable, lbs for pounds, and I'm going to set it equal to the prompt, which asks weight in pounds ? Then what I'm going to do is create another variable called kilograms, or kg, which is equal to the variable lbs, or pounds, times 0.454. And then I'm going to alert the user that is, and let's concatenate it with the kilograms, kg, plus, and then say kilograms. And note my spacing here. That way it actually reads nicely. And let's add some semicolons here. And we're going to talk more about semicolons later on. It's actually not necessary to have them here on each line, but it's good practice. And then we're going to add in a log to this. So if you just start typing log, you'll actually get the whole console.log there. And I will say conversion complete. So now let's refresh this page and see what happens. It says weight in pounds. I'll say 100 pounds. Tells me it's 45.4 kilograms. I hit OK, and I get conversion complete at the bottom. And that's really all there was to it. So again, just 4 lines of JavaScript, and hopefully now you feel really comfortable setting a variable, using prompt, using alert, and using console.log. If you have any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums. I'll see you all at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome to part 4 of JavaScript Level 1, Operators. It's time to learn about comparison and logical operators with JavaScript, and these operators are going to allow us to begin to add logic to our JavaScript code. And as a quick note, there are also 5 optional quick exercises at the end of this lecture, and you can find them under the part4_operators.js file that's under the JavaScript Level 1 folder. Okay, let's hop to our console and get started. Okay, so here I have the editor open as well as my browser, and I have the console open in my browser. Remember, you can always just right-click, hit inspect, and then go over to the console. And on this left-hand side, I have the actual course notes open. So what we're going to be doing is quickly reviewing booleans. Remember, they're all lowercase. It's just true and false. And what we want to do is start off with comparison operators. And comparison operators allow us to compare 2 items and return a boolean. And I want you to pay special attention to what happens when we actually reach equality and we test if something's equal or not. So we'll start off with the simple ones, which are things such as greater than. So if I check, is 3 greater than 2? Well, that's true. Is 2 greater than 3? That's false. So that's greater than. There's also less than, so 1 less than 2. There's greater than or equal to. So is 2 greater than 2? Well, that's false, but is 2 greater than or equal to 2? That's true. So there's greater than or equal to, and there's also less than or equal to. So we can see here. Let me clear my console to come back up here. And now what I want to do is take a little bit of time to discuss equality and its special quirk. So let's say I ask, is 2 equals 2? Well, that returns true. And typically in a lot of languages, this would be how you test for equality. And this would also work for things such as strings. So if I have something like user as a string, and I check equals user, then it returns true. But here's where it gets a little strange. Let's say I have a string called 2, and I say equals 2, and I want to see if this is true or not. If I hit enter on this, JavaScript, unlike a lot of other programming languages, is actually going to report that this is true. And usually you do not want this to be true. You do not want a string 2 to be equal to the actual number 2. So how do we actually take care of this situation? Well, what you end up doing is just adding another equal sign there. So you report back equals 2. and this will be now false. So if you want to check equality of not just the actual number here, what it's saying, but of actual type, you want to use triple equal sign. Okay, so let's take a little bit of time to discuss the real differences between the triple equal sign, which returns false, and the double equal sign, which returns true in this situation. And what's happening when you only use two equal signs is JavaScript is using what's known as type coercion, which basically means it's trying its best to convert both of the objects to similar data types to actually perform the comparison. And a lot of times you don't actually want that. You want to compare two objects based not just on what they represent to a user, but what they actually represent in the data type space. So one is a string, one is a number, they shouldn't be the same. So the way you do that is you add in that extra equal sign to have three equal signs there. And you actually do the same thing with inequality. So if you want to check inequality, not just the value, but also of data type, you do this. So I want to check, is 5 not equals to 5, the string? That ends up being true. So I add the equal sign there. If I only used one equal sign here, then I would have gotten false. So remember, for most use cases, we want to add in that extra equal sign. So we want 3 equal signs to test for equality, and then an exclamation mark, 2 equal signs to test for inequality. So here, this is saying that the digit 5 is truly not equal to the string 5. If I only use one of these, in this case, so I don't add that extra equal sign, it'll say something like the digit is actually not equal to 5. And it's a little weird because there's a double negative here, the falsely unequal. So just to clarify, you'll always want to use the triple equal signs and then exclamation mark 2 equal signs for inequality. Okay, so we always want to check for equality and inequality, not just of value, but also of type. So let's talk about a few more situations. It's really common in programming languages for 0 and 1 to be substitutes for true and false. And let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to clear this, and we can actually scroll down the notes and see what I'm talking about here. If I say true is equal to 1, I actually get true back. And if I check as true equals to 1, I get false back. So this is just a quick note that a lot of times we can see 1 as far as the type coercion and how JavaScript's trying to get types to compare to each other. I could have also used 1 to kind of act as true. And the same goes for 0 and false. So false equals 0, that returns true. But if I'm checking not just for value, but also for data type, then I get false here. Okay, so that's a little bit of a quirky behavior if you haven't seen this before in other programming languages. And there's also a little bit of a weird behavior for null, undefined, and NaN values. So if I check does null equals undefined, I end up getting true, which is a little bit strange. And if I use triple equal signs, I get false. So that's just something to keep in mind. And if I say is NaN equals to NaN, I actually get false there, which is kind of weird behavior, and we'll be talking a lot more about that later on, but I do want you to be aware of there's some funky behavior when you're checking for equality and you're just doing comparison operators with these null, undefined, and NaN values. So keep that in mind. We'll touch on this later on, but this is just something for you to be aware of. To begin with, a lot of our problems won't even deal with null or undefined values, so don't worry about it too much right now. Let's clear that out, and let's begin talking about logical operators. Logical operators just allow us to combine multiple comparison operators. So let's say we wanted to know if 1 is equal to 1, and we also wanted to know if 2 is equal to 2. Well, how can I combine both of those? Typically, you would use an AND operator. And in the case of JavaScript, the AND operator uses 2 ampersands, which is this symbol right here. So here I can check, is 1 equal to 1 and is 2 equal to 2? In that case, they're both true. So in order for this to return true, both of these statements have to be true. And I can actually tack on more than that. So I could say, is 1 triple equals to 1 and is 2 equal to 2 and is 1 equal to 2. And this returns false because while these first two were true, this last one was false. And because they're all ands, they all have to be true. Then, if we clear the screen here, we can also use OR operators. And OR operators are written with what's known as the pipe operator. And they only need one condition to be true to return true. So for instance, is 1 equal to 2? And that's what OR looks like, that pipe operator. You usually find it above the Enter or Shift key on your keyboard, and you just do Shift backslash to actually get that pipe operator. What we see is 1 equal to 2, or is 1 equal to 1, and that's true because only one of these conditions had to be true. And then we also have the NOT operator. So NOT operator, that's not as common to use, no pun intended there, but let's also check it out. It's basically a way of checking the opposite of a condition. So for instance, I'll put this in parentheses. If I want to check is 1 equal to 1, well, that's true. What if I want to check if the opposite is true? Well, then I can add an exclamation point in front of this to check. So this exclamation mark will return the opposite of whatever is in here. And the opposite of true is false. So when I hit enter, I should see false there. So it's basically a way of checking the opposite of a condition. And you can also stack these. So you can do exclamation mark, 1 equals 1. But this is definitely not that common to use. And hopefully you never see just a bunch of exclamation marks like this, because really this kind of makes no sense and this is just bad code, but it is functional code. Okay, so that's really all there is to discuss about comparison operators and logical operators. For the most part, they're pretty straightforward. The only things I really want you to pay attention to is the use of this triple equal sign versus just the double equal sign. And I want you throughout the course to be extra vigilant about that, especially when you're working with JavaScript. And I also want you to be aware of this kind of weird behavior with null, undefined, and NaN. We won't run into this that often throughout this course, but I do want you to be aware of it. And then scrolling back down all the way to the bottom of the notes, we have some exercises here. So let me just expand this and show you. So here are there's 5 quick exercise questions for you. And what I want you to do is, knowing that x is equal to 1 and y is equal to 2, mentally evaluate these expressions right here. So there's 5 expressions for you to mentally evaluate them. Once you think you know the answer in your head, just copy and paste this line to the console to actually see if you're correct. So let's do the first one together, and then I'll let you do the other 4 on your own. So if x is equal to 1 and y is equal to 2, let's see what we have here. On this left-hand side, I see is the string 2 equals to the number 2. Well, we learned previously that doubles equal sign instead of triple equal sign will only check for the value, not the actual data type. So I know this side is true. And then I say, and is x triple equals to 1. So that's checking both for value and data type. Well, I know that the number 1 is equal to the number 1. So I believe that exercise 1 should return true, since both sides of this and statement are true. Let's check it out. I'm going to copy this and paste it into my console. So I have those 2 variables, and now let's copy and paste this line, put it into my console, and it looks like I was correct. We got true. Okay, so that's basically all I want you to do. Mentally evaluate the other 4 here, and you can check your own solutions against the console commands. Okay, thanks everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to post the Q&A forums. I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome to Part 5, Control Flow. Control flow is a fundamental aspect of any full programming language, and it allows us to execute code only if a certain situation or condition arises, and we can use it in combination with logical and comparison operators. In case this is your first time programming, we're going to briefly go over the main concepts of control flow, such as if statements, else statements, and else if statements in this lecture. If you've already programmed in another language before, you may actually find it more useful just to reference the notes for this lecture to get the JavaScript syntax, since a lot of these concepts are the same across programming languages. The only thing that's different is the actual syntax. So let's continue on and actually discuss control flow. So usually when you're dealing with control flow, you're going to initiate some sort of condition check that returns a Boolean, which is either true or false. And then based off those results, you use control flow to execute a specific block of code. Let's see the first basic example, which is an if statement. So an if statement, the general syntax looks like this. You say if, and then some condition. And that condition right there is usually some sort of comparison operator, or you're checking for some sort of equality. So we say if this condition is true, we execute some code that's inside those curly brackets. So the syntax is if, in parentheses, the condition check, and then in curly brackets, you're going to execute some sort of code. Then there's the if-else statement. And the main logic behind this is if some condition is true, you execute some code, that very first line there. Else, meaning if that condition was not true, you execute some other code. So here we're just checking if a condition is true, we execute some code. If it doesn't happen to be true, then the else statement occurs and we execute some other code. And then we have the if, else if, and else statements. So if you want to check for multiple conditions, not just one, you can add an else if statement. So the syntax looks like this. We say if, you check for some condition number 1, you execute some code. Then you can have an else if to check for another possible condition, and then you execute some other code. If condition 1 and condition 2 don't bring up true, so neither of those conditions happen to be true, then finally the else block executes some backup code. Okay, let's actually code through some examples. That was just general syntax and a very high-level overview, but I think if we code through some examples, it'll make it a lot clearer. I'm going to open up my editor in my browser now. Alright, so here I have an HTML file open and a JavaScript file open. They're both blank, and my browser is connected right now to that HTML file. So let's actually fill in this HTML file, and then also connect it to the script. So I'm going to write script, I can get rid of that, and just say the source is my script.js. Okay, and let's make sure this is working by adding some sort of alert here that says, hello, save this, I'll refresh my page, and I get the alert, hello. Great, so we're connected to the JavaScript. That way, if I want to run more than one line of JavaScript code, all I have to do is type it to this .js file and then refresh my browser over here. And let's actually open up the console here as well. So I'm going to say inspect, hit the console, and now I can see output. So to begin seeing an if statement in action, we're going to start by creating two variables. First, we'll create hot, and we'll say it's false. And then I'll create another variable called temp, and I will say it's equal to 60. And what we're going to do is just apply some very simple logic code. So we say if some condition is true, then we execute the code inside of those curly brackets. So for example, we have these two variables, hot and temp, and imagine that hot starts off as false, and temperature, or temp, is some number in degrees. And if the temp is greater than 80, we want to assign hot is equal to true. So if it's more than 80 degrees, I'm going to say that hot is now true. So what does this look like? Well, I can say if, and I can actually hit enter here, and Atom will automatically fill in that sort of syntax scaffolding. And the most basic if statement is just if true. So let's run this one first. I'm going to say if true, I will log I ran. Refresh the page here, and it says I ran. So that's the very most basic if statement. If true, and then this always runs because it will always be true. Let's show you something a little more realistic using those two variables. I'll say if the temperature is greater than 80, log temp is greater than 80. We'll save that, refresh our page, and now we actually don't get any output, which makes sense because remember, temperature is 60. But now let's do this. If temperature is greater than 80, I will say hot is equal to true. And this is actually the first time we show this, but this is how you can reassign a variable in JavaScript. So right now I initiated it with the var call. So this is for initializing that variable, but if I just want to reassign it, I have to make sure it's reassigned to the same data type here. So it's also a Boolean, but in this case I'm reassigning it to true. And then I'm going to log hot. So let's see what happens. If I refresh this page, I get false. So what actually happened here? Well, I have my variable, hot is equal to false, the temperature is 60. I said if the temperature is greater than 80, reassign hot to be true, and then finally output hot. Since temperature was not greater than 80, this reassignment never occurred, meaning hot is always going to stay false. Now let's try this again, but set the temperature to be higher than 80. 100. So take a moment and think what we'll see when I actually refresh this page. Will it be false or true? I'm going to refresh, and it's true, which makes sense because the temperature is now 100, meaning if the temperature is greater than 80, 100 is greater than 80, reassign hot to be equal to true, and then log whatever hot currently is. And hot was reassigned to true. And that's the very basics of an if statement. Now let's imagine that we want to execute another block that occurs if the if statement is false. Well, in that case, we can use an else statement to do this. Let's add that in. So I'm going to say just console log up here, console log hot outside. So if the temperature is greater than 80, I'm going to say it's hot outside. Else, and you can see that Adam's helping me out here, so I'll just take its help. Else, I will log it's not very hot today. And you might be wondering, hey, why doesn't else actually have this parentheses check here? And the reason is because else doesn't need to check for any specific condition. Remember, else is going to occur only if all the conditions above it never were activated. They were never true. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm going to delete this line right here, and I'm going to set temperature equal to 100. So let's think what's going to log if I set temperature equal to 100. I'll refresh this page, and it says it's hot outside. So that makes sense. If the temperature is greater than 80, log it's hot outside. Now let's set the temperature to be 50 degrees. What do we think is going to happen when I refresh the page? It's not very hot today. That makes sense because this if statement was never triggered as true, meaning this else statement is going to occur. It's not very hot today. And that's the basics of an if-else statement. Okay, so we saw how if statements work, how if-else statements work. Now let's see how else-if statements work. So again, if we want to check more conditions than just one single condition and its opposite, we can add else-if statements to check for multiple specific conditions. And the way it looks is like this. And you can see that Atom Text Editor will actually help us out. And we see else if, I'll hit enter, and it makes sense that there's parentheses here now because I want to check if another certain condition is true. So let's actually check for multiple temperature ranges. So right now, if the temperature is greater than 80 degrees, I say it's hot outside. Now let's imagine that it's just pretty average or nice outside. So the temperature is less than or equal to 80. And the temperature is greater than or equal to 50 degrees. So somewhere in between 50 and 80. I'll say average temp outside. Now let's check for another condition. Again, we'll call else if, and inside this parentheses, I'll put in another condition, something like temperature less than 50 and temperature greater than or equal to 32 degrees. I'll log that it's pretty cold out. And then finally, I'm going to want an else statement. And for this else statement, I'm going to say it is very cold out. And the reason for that is because I know the else statement is only going to occur if the temperature is not greater than 80, it's not in between 80 and 50, and it's not in between 32 and 50, meaning else statement is only going to occur when the temperature is less than 32 degrees. So let's try this out and make sure we got everything right. I'm going to refresh my page here. Remember, our starting temperature is 50 degrees. So if I refresh this, I would expect it to say average temp outside because we fall right here. Temperature is equal to 50. Let's make average temp outside go again with something like 70 degrees. Save this, refresh, and there it is again, average temperature outside. Let's make it say it's pretty cold out. So I'll say it's 40 degrees outside, refresh, and it says it's pretty cold out. And now let's make it something like 10 degrees. If I refresh this page, then it says it is very cold out, meaning none of these conditions were actually activated, so the else statement was activated. Okay, let's do one final example of comparison operators. So I will delete all this. And let's start with kind of a store example. So I'll make a variable called ham, set it equal to 10. Whoops, variable called ham, set it equal to 10. And then I'll create another variable called cheese and set it equal to 10. And we'll discuss semicolons later on. You don't actually need those there, so don't worry about having semicolons everywhere right now. But let's say we want to report back to headquarters what our ham and cheese sales were. We run a little store that sells ham and cheese. So I'm going to make my variable report equal to a string that's just blank right now. And then I'll start off with my first if statement, and I will say if the sales of ham is greater than 10, greater than or equal to 10, and cheese is greater than or equal to 10, I'm going to say my report is equal to strong sales of both ham and cheese. Then let's have an else if statement. And the else if statement is going to say else if ham is equal to 0 and cheese is equal to 0, my report is going to be equal to nothing sold. And let's keep things simple with an else statement, and I will say report is equal to we had some sales of items. And you can keep adding else if statements for things like if you only sold ham or you only sold cheese that day, what would it look like? But at the end of this, outside of these if statements, I'm going to say log or console.log, and I will log my report. So let's refresh this and see what we get. So it says strong sales of both ham and cheese. That makes sense. Ham and cheese are both 10 right now. Let's say ham is 1. We'll refresh this page. We had some sales of items. That makes sense. And let's change it so that nothing was sold. Ham is equal to 0 and cheese is equal to 0. Refresh our page and it says nothing sold. Okay, great. Hopefully now you have a general understanding of if statements, if-else statements, and else-if statements in JavaScript. Coming up next, we're going to begin discussing loops with the while loop. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 6, While Loops. So let's learn a bit about while loops in JavaScript. And loops in general allow us to automatically repeat blocks of code. And the while loop will continually execute code as long as a condition remains true. And like I mentioned for the previous lecture, if you're already familiar with while loops from another programming language, you may just want to check the notes for this lecture and just reference the syntax changes yourself. Okay, in case you're new to a while loop, let's see what it actually looks like. So in JavaScript, a while loop looks like this. You say the keyword while, and then in parentheses you have some sort of condition. And then inside the curly brackets, you execute some code, and that code is going to be continually executed while that condition is true. And something to be careful with while loops is if you have a condition that will always remain true no matter what, then that while loop will execute forever. And that may lead to buggy code because your while loop just never breaks, it always stays running forever. Okay, let's see some actual examples, and we're also going to learn about a few keywords such as the break keyword, which will break out of a top-level block of code. Let's jump to our editor to get started. Okay, so just like last time, I have an HTML script that's connected to my JavaScript, this myscript.js, and that in turn has the HTML connected to this browser. So let's get started with a very simple while loop example. I'm going to create a variable called x and set it equal to 0. And then I can begin typing while, hit enter, and Atom helps me out with the rest of the context. So I say while x is less than 5. That's the condition I want. I'm going to perform some action. I will log x is currently, and then I'm going to say plus x here, so that prints out. And then I'm also going to log x is still less than 5, adding 1 to x. And then finally, to make sure this doesn't run forever, I'm going to say x is equal to x plus 1. So before we run this, let's break down what's actually happening here. I start off with x equals 0. This is outside this while loop. Then inside this while loop, I'll say, while x is less than 5, I want you to execute this block of code. And the first block of code, or the first line of code on line 4 says just x is currently, and then whatever the current number of x is. And then, as long as x is still less than 5, my condition, I'll also log x is still less than 5, adding 1 to x. And then finally, on line 7, I'll say x is equal to x plus 1. So I reassign x to the current x plus 1. And I'll also show you later on some syntax to have a shortcut of doing this sort of operation. But let's save that. And now let's run our browser, or refresh our browser page here, and see what we get. So we get a lot of output. Let's expand this and see what's happening here. So I get x is currently 0. That makes sense. So it's still less than 5. I add 1 to x. x is currently 1, and this keeps going all the way until it prints out x is currently 4, which makes sense. If x is currently 4, I would log x is still less than 5, adding 1 to x. And note that once I add 1 to x, then x becomes 5, and 5 is no longer less than 5, it's equal to 5. So the while loop stops operating, which is why we never see x is currently 5. And that's the very basics of how a while loop works. Okay, now let's add in some manual break conditions, which will exit out of the loop. And it's going to use the keyword break. So right now I'm going to start with variable x is equal to 0. I'll say while x is less than 5, and I'm going to console again log x is currently x, and then here I'm going to add in some control flow with an if statement. And I will say if x is equal to 3, I'm going to log x is equal to 3. And that's all I'll do for now. So let's run this code again and see what happens. So it looks like very much the same code, 0, 1, 2, 3, except when x is currently 3, before I say x is less than 5, I get this big announcement, x is equal to 3. Now let's actually try to break the while loop on this certain condition. And the way we can do that is by adding in the special keyword break. And this will break out of the top level loop it's in. Basically what this is saying is if x is equal to 3, log this and then break out of the top level loop you find this keyword in. And that happens to be this while loop. So let's save this, expand this, and refresh the page. And now we see when I refresh, it stops at this x is equal to 3 line. So it says x is equal to 3, and then it breaks out of that while loop. And that's how we can use the keyword break to essentially prematurely break out of a while loop so that we don't have to wait until this condition is naturally meant to be false. And that's really all there is to the while loop. We'll use it later on in the course, but as a quick exercise, I want you to do this. Write a while loop that prints out only the even numbers from 1 to 10. So again, just to clarify what I want you to do right now, I'll write it in here as a comment. Write a while loop that prints out only the even numbers from 1 to 10. Okay, so pause the video, see if you can do it on your own, and then I'm going to write out the solution for this question. Just write a while loop that prints out only the even numbers from 1 to 10. Okay, so let's get started with this. I'm going to clear everything I have here in my editor. Hopefully you were able to actually do this yourself, or at least attempt it yourself, but everything's clear, so let's try it out. Okay, so let's see how we can attempt to solve this problem. First thing I'm going to do is create a variable called num, and start it off equal to 1. Then I'm going to create my while loop, and I want to go from numbers 1 to 10, so I will say, while my number is less than 11, and let's just start off with a very simple example. I will log the number, and then say num is equal to num plus 1. Save this, and let's see if this works. Refresh the page, and here I get all the numbers from 1 to 10. But the assignment is to only print out these even numbers, so I need some sort of method to check if a number is even. And hopefully you remember from the number, or the very basics of JavaScript lecture, that very first JavaScript lecture, we taught you the mod operator. So I'm going to say if num mod 2 is equal to 0, then I can do something and I know that the number is even. So I will log that number. So what does that actually mean? Well, remember that mod checks for a remainder. And I know if a number divided by 2 leaves a remainder equal to 0, then that number is even. So 6 divided by 2 has no remainder, 8 divided by 2 has no remainder, etc. Okay. And then lastly, I want to make sure this doesn't run forever. So outside of that if, I'm going to say num is equal to num plus 1. So let's save that and see if I refresh the page, it works. And there we have it, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And those are all the even numbers from 1 to 10 using a while loop. Take your time if this was a little confusing for you. And some key things to remember here is this mod operator. This is a really common way to check if a number is even. And also key to this is to remember to increase the number and to remember to increase the number outside of this if statement. If you only had it inside of this if statement, that would cause problems because you would only be adding 1 if the number was even. You wouldn't do it on the odd numbers. And you can tell if something is within the block using these curly brackets as indicators. And indentation for JavaScript doesn't matter a whole lot, although you should try to keep your code readable and clean. Later on when we talk about Python, indentation is going to be a huge aspect of it. Okay, so thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture where we're going to begin to discuss for loops. I'll see you there. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 7, For Loops. So we're going to be learning about the most basic for loop in JavaScript in this lecture, and if you've only dealt with for loops in Python before, you may actually want to watch this lecture instead of just reading the notes, because the syntax for a for loop or a basic for loop in JavaScript is going to appear quite different to you versus Python's for loop. Okay, so what is a for loop? Well, a for loop allows you to continually execute code, usually a specific number of times, or linked to the elements in a sequence. Now, JavaScript has three types of for loops. It has its most basic for loop, which just iterates through some block of code a certain number of times. Then it has the for in construct, which loops through a JavaScript object. And a JavaScript object is a data structure in JavaScript that we haven't covered yet. And then there's also the for of loop, which is used with JavaScript arrays, which again is another data structure we haven't actually covered yet. So until we cover those, we'll leave for in loops and for of loops aside for now. And as a quick note, previously we used the notation num is equal to num plus 1 when during a loop we wanted to increment the variable num by just 1. There's also two other ways of writing that, and that is num plus equal to 1 or num plus plus. And if you wanted to subtract 1, you would just say num minus equals 1 or num minus minus. So these are all the same. All three of these statements are doing the exact same thing. That's just a heads up because with JavaScript, the most common one you'll see is the very last one, num plus plus. Alright, this is what the most basic version of a for loop in JavaScript looks like. You have your for keyword statement, and then you have three other statements separated by semicolon inside of parentheses, and inside curly brackets you execute some code for the for loop. So let's actually describe what each of these statements represents, and we'll show you an example as we go along. So statement 1 is executed before the loop or that code block even begins. And that can be something like defining the variable I is equal to 0. And we can think of that similar to the while loop where we just said something like num is equal to 0 or x is equal to 0. So statement 1 is executed before the loop even really starts. Then we have statement 2, which is there in the middle. And statement 2 defines the condition for running the loop. And in this case, we can almost think of this for loop as just another syntax way of writing a while loop. So what's an example of that? Well, statement 2 could be something like this, while I is less than 5. So here we can see we're almost just rewriting a while loop inside of this for statement. We're starting off with the variable I is equal to 0, and we're saying keep running this loop while I is less than 5. And then finally, statement 3 is what is executed each time after the loop cycles through once. So just like a while loop we saw earlier, we may want to incrementally add to I. So here, what this for loop is saying is start off with the variable I is equal to 0. And while I is less than 5, do some code, and then every cycle you're going to add 1 to I, or I++. Alright, so let's see some examples of for loops in the editor. Alright, so here's my editor, and I have my browser with my console open, and it's linked just as we've done in previous lectures. Let's start off with the most basic for loop that we initially discussed. So again, I'm going to say something like for, and I can actually hit enter here. Note that Atom gives you the three options, the for in, and then for of. We'll start with just the most basic for. We hit enter, and what's really nice is Atom takes care of a lot of the stuff right now. It takes care of statement 1, that initialization of a variable, takes care of statement 2, which is what we actually want to run through, kind of the while condition, and then I++, or statement 3, what we want to happen after every time this is run. Now, let's actually change the array.length to just be less than 5. And we're going to say console.log number is, and then we'll concatenate it with I. So let's save this and actually run this here. And here I can see number is 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And hopefully you can see this is basically just another way of rewriting a for loop, or excuse me, a while loop, where we have some initial condition, the while condition, and then what we want to do after every time this loop runs. And like I mentioned earlier, this I++ is just another way of writing I is equal to I plus 1. So I can save that, and if I refresh, I'll get the exact same result. And another note is that this doesn't actually have to be I. You could call this whatever you want. So you could say variable num, while num is less than 5. And we could say num++, write that as num, save this, we refresh, and we get the exact same result. It's most commonly used for I, so keep that in mind. You'll see I a lot, but sometimes it might be helpful to you to rename it if it helps the readability of your code. But more often than not, you're just going to see it as I. And it's so often I that's why Atom Text Editor auto-fills it to be I. Okay, so let's continue on with another example. I'm going to create a variable called word, and let's just have it be the first few letters of the alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. Okay, and then I'll start typing 4, hit enter, and I'm going to say for I is equal to 0, I array.length, and Atom Text Editor actually auto-highlights array for me to change it to something. So I will change it to word, and you can see that it's actually auto-filling that in for me over inside the for loop, which is quite nice. And I'm going to log this. So I will say log, whoops, let me click somewhere to deactivate that, and then we'll say log, and I'm going to input word indexed at that location. Okay, so let's save this, and what do you think is going to happen here? Take some time. So we'll refresh, and we see here now we get A, B, C, D, E, F, G all the way to K. So again, this is just a way of kind of rewriting the while loop. So we start at I equals 0, and while I is less than the length of the actual word, keep incrementing I, and then print out the index location at I, so A, B, C, D, etc. All right, now let's show you another example where, let's say we wanted to skip every other letter or something. So to make that obvious, I will do something like this. A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. And then I'll write a for loop here. And I'm going to keep most things the same, except over here, where it says I++, I can do something like I is equal to I plus 2. And let's log this again, and put that inside. And now what do you think is going to happen when I refresh this page? Well, I can see A printed out 5 times. And if something is repeatedly input into the console, Google Chrome will actually just put a little number here next to it instead of flooding your screen with repeated code or repeated output. So this little number here represents that A was printed out 5 times, which makes sense because if you look at this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 A's in that word. So hopefully you can see here that it doesn't have to just increment by 1, it can increment by any number you want. Or it can even go down, it can decrease. Okay, so that's all we need to know about for loops in JavaScript for now. Coming up next, we're going to do a quick exercise just to practice your understanding. I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back to Part 8, Loop Exercises. So you've learned enough about loops, it's time to do just a few exercises. The exercises are located under the JavaScript Level 1 folder, and the file you're looking for is called part8_loops_exercise.js. And then there's also a solutions JavaScript, so make sure you don't peek at the solutions before attempting them on your own. In the next lecture, I'll be walking through the actual exercise solutions. So check out the JavaScript. All the instructions are comment code in that actual file. Just open it up and follow the directions. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Part 8, where we're going to be going over the solutions to the loop exercise questions from the previous lecture. So let's continue. I'm going to open up my editor to get started. Okay, here I have the actual problems uploaded in the JavaScript with the comments that I had to follow. And what we're going to be doing first is problem 1, where I had to use a for loop to print or console log out the word hello 5 times. And we never actually did something quite like this, but hopefully you were able to figure it out with both methods. So with a while loop, let's show you how we can do that. We'll say variable x is equal to 0. And you could have chosen any variable name here. The name doesn't actually matter. Then we'll say a while loop. Now we'll say while x is less than 5, I'm going to console.log hello. And then I want to remember to add 1 to x and increment it. So now, if I run my code, I see hello, and it's been output 5 times. Google Chrome just lets you know that with this little shortcut, the bubble of 5 there. Up next, we have the for loop, and I wanted to use a for loop to do this. So essentially, we can just break down what we were doing up here above. So I have variable I is equal to 0. Since I is going to be less than 5, I'll put that here, and I'll leave I++, and then I can actually just copy and paste the console log command. And just to make sure it's actually working, I'm going to say something like hello with for loop. We'll save that. Let's run this code, and I see hello and then hello with for loop They both ran 5 times. Great. Let's move on to problem 2. Problem 2 was just to use loops to console.log or print out all the odd numbers from 1 to 25. And we wanted to do this using 2 methods, the while loop and then a for loop. Let's start off with the while loop. I'm going to make a variable called num. And in the solutions, I actually just reassign num from a previous problem. And then I'm going to say while my num is less than 25 if num mod 2 is not equal to 0. Remember previously if we wanted to check for an even number, we said num mod 2 equal to 0. In this case, we're doing the exact opposite for odd numbers. I'm going to log that num. And then I also want to make sure that I continually add to num, so I'll just say num plus plus. So let's make sure that actually worked. I'm going to refresh my page here. And there are all the odd numbers, 1 all the way to 23 for the while loop. And now for the for loop, let's do that as well. I'm going to say for, and then I'm going to fix some of these. So it says instead of the actual length of the array, this is going to be 5. Let's expand this a little bit. So I'm going to say if I mod 2 is not equal to 0, log I. And that's really all there is to this. Let's make sure my brackets are balanced. So we'll save that. And let's comment everything else out so we make sure that only that is running. So we'll save this, scroll all the way down, refresh my page. And here I only see 1 through 3, so let me make sure I went all the way. That should have been 25. Okay, now let's refresh our page. And there we have it, 1 through 23. Great. And that's how you could do it with a for loop. So that's it, just 2 pretty simple problems, and hopefully you can begin to see the relationship between the while loop and the for loop. Okay, thanks everybody, and in the next lecture, we're going to get practice on everything we covered in JavaScript Level 1 with a little bit of an assessment project. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back to Part 9, JavaScript Level 1 project. So we've completed all the normal lectures for JavaScript Level 1, and now it's time to actually do a project. And for this project, you'll be creating a simple website that asks a visitor questions using JavaScript and the prompt function that we worked with earlier. However, through all of these questions, you're going to be secretly checking to see if there's a spy present, and the spy is going to answer the questions in a very particular way. Behind the scenes, you're going to be using JavaScript to check for certain correct answers to the questions, and if you find the spy due to the correct answers, you're going to leave them a secret message in the console for them to check. Okay, you're going to be needing to check the part9_js_project.html file for the full instructions and the full correct answers. An example solution of the JavaScript file is located under part9.js. So remember to link to your own .js script before getting started. So again, you're only going to be editing a JavaScript file. You won't actually be touching any HTML. Alright, let's briefly explore the instruction page and see an example of what it should look like after you're done with it. I'm going to hop over to the editor and browser now. Okay, here I have the actual HTML document open in my editor, and I also have it linked to the JavaScript file that contains the solutions, and this is what it looks like over here in the browser. So again, just quickly to point out, if you scroll all the way down on the part9 JavaScript project.html page, right here under the script connection, it will connect to the solution script. So it'll actually connect to part9.js. That's what you can connect it to if you want to see what an example solution looks like in your browser. But I recommend that once you're done dealing with that, you change the source to your own JavaScript file so you can play around with working through the solution. Again, everything you're doing is just in a JavaScript file. You won't actually be editing any HTML for this. So let me show you what the actual HTML looks like. I've linked it here in my browser. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can read it together. But here we have the Welcome to Part 9, your JavaScript Level 1 project. And like I mentioned, for this project, you're going to be building a generic website that just seems to ask some mundane questions to normal users, but secretly you are looking for a spy, and anyone visiting your website is going to be asked a series of questions, but only the spy is going to give you specific answers that you expect. And if all the questions are answered correctly, you're going to post a secret message in the console for the spy to read. So it's up to you whatever the secret message is, but you're going to use console.log if they answer the questions correctly. So here are the 4 conditions you're going to be checking for the spy. So the spy has the same first letter of her first name and her last name. So, for example, someone could be named Jose Johnson, and J match, so that's the first letter and last letter, so that's a correct condition for the SPY. The SPY is also between the age of 20 and 30, exclusive of 20 and 30. So, for example, a 26-year-old SPY works. Then the SPY is also at least 170 centimeters tall. Here we have 175 centimeters, and then the SPY has a pet name that ends with the letter Y. And in this case, a pet name of Sammy would work. So you're going to ask the SPY for their first name, last name, what is their age, what is their height in centimeters, and what is their pet name. And if they answer everything correctly according to these conditions, so you're going to check these conditions using everything you learned about control flow, you will log a secret message to the console. And then they can inspect the page, look at the console, and see if you left them anything. All right, so again, we're just using JavaScript here, and you can prompt for the information in any order you want, and you can even do things like separate the first name prompt from the last name prompt. That'll probably make your life a little easier. But all we're doing is just checking to see if these 4 conditions are true. This one, this one, this one, and this one. So let's actually refresh this page and see what happens, what this actually looks like. I'm going to refresh, and it says, hello and welcome. Please enter your first name. We'll say Jose. Enter your last name. We'll say Johnson. How old are you? We'll say 26. We'll say we're 175 centimeters. And the name of our pet is Sammy. I'll hit OK. It says, thank you so much for the information. I hit OK. And that's it. It looks like nothing happened. But if I inspect and go to my console, it says, welcome, comrade. You've passed the SPY test. And that's exactly what you're going to be doing. Let's refresh this page and make sure that if I just input garbage, so let's say my name is Andy Will, I'm 42, I'm 10 centimeters tall, my name of my pet is, I don't know, Fad. Hit OK, and it says, sorry, nothing to see here. Okay, hopefully you get an idea of what this project's actually getting at. In the next lecture, I'll be coding out some solutions in the JavaScript file. Thanks everyone, hope you enjoy the project. I'll see you at the next lecture. And welcome back. Hopefully you already attempted the JavaScript Level 1 project, because in this lecture we'll be coding through an example solution for it. Okay, I'm excited, so let's get started by hopping over to the editor. Okay, so here I have my editor open. I've linked the HTML file to my own script. My script is right now empty, so nothing's going on when I refresh this page. So let's expand our editor, add everything we need, and then we'll test it out with the actual website page. So I'm going to zoom in just a little more so we can see everything clearly. Okay, the first thing I need to do is have the 4 conditions that I'm going to be checking. Remember, those 4 conditions are this. It's the name condition, so I'm going to make variables for these. And the name condition will have it be null to start off with. And the name condition is, does their first letter of their first name match the first letter of their last name? And you can actually not have them be null. They can be anything because we're going to be reassigning these later on. But I'm just going to make them null to be clear that they're nothing right now. And if we want, we can put semicolons there. The age condition, so they have to be between 20 and 30 exclusive. We also have the height condition, and that's going to be null. And then we also finally have the pet name condition. So I will say var pet condition is null. Okay, so those are the 4 conditions that I'm checking for. But remember, I'm actually going to need to ask some questions first. So let's put those questions at the top. I'm going to grab the first name. It's going to be a prompt. Whoops, not what I wanted. A prompt. And I will ask, first name, please. And you can basically write as much or as little as you want in that. Then we'll ask for the last name. And I'm going to, sorry about that. There it is, prompt. Okay. I'm going to ask for the last name, please. And then the next variable I want is age. So I'm going to ask, how old are you? Question mark. I also want height. So that's another prompt. So just a bunch of prompts that we ask the user when they reach the page. What is your height? Question mark. And then finally, pet name. We'll ask for a prompt. What is your pet name? Question mark. So we have everything. After all of that, I'm just going to say an alert. Thank you so much for the information. And it doesn't matter a whole lot whether we define these 4 condition variables before or after this, but I like the idea of grabbing all the variables that we need from the user first, and then having all our logic below it. So we have those 4 conditions. Let's start using control flow to actually check if these conditions are true or false. So the first one we need to check is the name condition. So remember, the name condition asks, is the first letter of their first name and the first letter of their last name the same thing? So I'm going to say if first name index at 0 is equal to last name index at 0, set the name condition to be equal to true. Else, the name condition is going to be equal to false. And that's a quick and easy way we can check if their first letter of their first name matches the first letter of their last name. Now we want to check the age condition. So how do we do that? Well, we want to say if age is greater than 20, so remember we're doing exclusive, so I don't put that equal sign, and age is less than 30, so we make sure not to overshoot this, I will say that the age condition is equal to true. Else, I know they didn't pass the age test, so age condition is equal to false. And hopefully now you can see why we could have assigned something else for the age condition. We could have assigned them all to be true or all to be false to begin with. Moving along, we have our age, we have the first name check, and now I want to check the height condition. So I will say if height is greater than or equal to 170, remember it was at least 170, then I want my height condition, you can see Adam helping us out here, to be true. And just like we've done last time, I'll say else height condition is equal to false. Pretty simple and pretty straightforward so far. And then last but not least, I want to make sure that the pet name is ending with Y. This one's a little tricky because we haven't shown anything quite like this, but hopefully you're able to figure it out. I'll say if the pet name, and then somehow I want to grab the last letter of the pet names. How do I actually do that? Well, we know how to grab the first letter, which is just 0. But if I want to grab the last letter, I'm going to have to take into account that pet names can be of different lengths. And one way I can do that is by calling petName.length. So we might think that this gives us the very last letter, but remember, indexing starts at 0, which means I need to subtract 1 from this in order to make it work. So you can imagine that if I had the pet name just be the letter A, and I want to check the last letter of the string of a single letter, I'd have to check 0, right? So even if it has length of 1, I'd have to say 1 minus 1 to actually grab that last letter. So that's just a quick explanation of why I have to do the minus 1 here. It's because indexing starts at 0. And if you don't believe me, you can kind of check it out and play with it yourself. And I want to make sure this is equal to Y. And if that's the case, then I know the pet condition will be reassigned to true. Else, I'll say pet condition is equal to false. Great. So I have the pet name there, and now I just want to check if all 4 conditions are true. So check all conditions. And what I'm going to do here is say if the name condition is true and the age condition is true and the height condition is true and the pet condition is true, I'm going to log something like welcome spy. Else we can either not do anything or just say nothing to see here. And sometimes what confuses beginners is the fact that I'm just writing here the actual condition. I'm not saying something like name condition equals true and age condition equals true, etc. But remember, these are already booleans themselves. So these conditions should already be booleans by the time they get to this stage. They're either all true or all false or some combination of true and false. Meaning I don't need to actually check is equal true because they're actually all conditional checks. So basically it's going to be something like true and false and true and false, or false and false and false, or true and true and true, etc. Okay, So you can always review the actual part9.javascript if you want the written code for everything I just did here. But let's save this and actually test it out to make sure it worked. Going to expand this. We are going to refresh. And here we see first name, please. I'll input Jose. Last name, we'll say John. How old am I? We'll say we're 27. What is my height? I'll say 180 centimeters. Pet name, I'll say Frankie with a Y. Thanks so much for the information. We right-click, inspect, check the console, and it says Welcome Spy. Let's make sure the inverse is true. So if I refresh this page, first name, just going to insert some garbage. Last name, some other garbage. How old am I? I'm 12 years old. We'll say we're 120 centimeters, and pet name is Alf. And it says nothing to see here. Perfect. So it looks like our solution worked correctly. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to post them to the Q&A forums, but you are now complete with JavaScript Level 1. It's time to move on to JavaScript Level 2. Thanks, and I'll see you at the next section of the course.